We all know that scammers like to target people of faith. They show up at churches, quote scripture, and promise that God wants you to prosper. They prey on trust and community, but they usually don't walk up to the pulpit, grab a microphone, and preach the sermon themselves. These three men did exactly that. Dennis Jali, John Frimpong, and Ali Johnson dressed like pastors, talked like pastors, and preached at local churches across Maryland, Texas, Florida, and Georgia. They told their congregations that investing with their company was part of God's mission, that financial freedom was divine will, that trusting them with your money was an act of faith. More than 200 people believed them. Many were African immigrants who had come to America for a better life, working double shifts as nurses and healthcare workers. They handed over their savings through wire transfers, checks, and cash. By the time the scheme collapsed, $28 million had vanished, and the men who claimed to serve God were living like kings on their congregation's money. This is the story of how three fake pastors pulled off one of the largest affinity fraud schemes in recent memory, and how they almost got away with it. The scheme started in January 2017, when Dennis Jali, a South African national living in Maryland, incorporated a company called the Smart Partners LLC. The company did business under a catchier name, First $1 Million. The name itself was part of the pitch. Your first $1 million, financial freedom, the American dream wrapped in a company logo. Jali positioned himself as the founder and CEO. He was 35 years old, originally from Umlazi in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. His LinkedIn page described him as a risk management expert and the CEO of what he called the Forex Billionaires Club. John Frimpong, a 40-year-old originally from Ghana, became the Chief Marketing Officer, and Ali Johnson, a 61-year-old from Bowie, Maryland, who claimed to be a Christian minister, served as Chief Operating Officer. Together, they rented office space in Largo, Maryland, complete with a professional reception area. They wanted to look legitimate. They needed to look legitimate because the scheme they were about to launch required absolute trust. The business model looked legitimate on paper. First Million presented itself as a wealth management and financial literacy company. They offered something called corporate guarantees, which were 12-month investment contracts that promised to invest your money in foreign currency and cryptocurrency markets. The returns they promised were extraordinary, anywhere from 6% to 35% per month, not per year, per month. They also promised that your original investment would be held in a special trust account, completely protected from market volatility. For anyone with even basic financial knowledge, those promises should have been immediate red flags. But Jali and his partners were not targeting sophisticated investors. They were targeting communities built on faith and trust. This is where things get truly sinister. Jali didn't just claim to be a financial expert. He claimed to be a pastor. He preached at local churches throughout the Maryland and Washington, D.C. area, including the church that Frimpong attended. During services, Jali would approach congregation members and talk about financial freedom. He would hand out cash to certain parishioners as proof of his supposed wealth and success as a trader. Think about how manipulative that is. You're sitting in church on Sunday morning, and a man who just finished preaching the gospel walks up and gives you money. You don't question him. You trust him. He's a man of God. The three men also recruited victims by hosting promotional events at upscale hotels and event spaces. They attended church-sponsored financial seminars specifically designed to attract investments from churchgoers, and everywhere they went, they presented themselves as religious men who cared more about their community's financial freedom than their own personal gain. FBI Special Agent Jennifer Boone would later describe it perfectly. In a time of such financial insecurity, the defendants allegedly preyed on their victims with false hope of financial security. But here's the thing, the investors weren't naive. The indictment identifies 9 of the victims, and they included nurses, an accountant, an engineer, and a car dealership manager. These were educated professionals. Many of them were African immigrants who had worked incredibly hard to establish themselves in America. They came from Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and other African nations. They had done everything right. They had gotten degrees, found good jobs, saved their money. They were exactly the people you would expect to recognize a scam. What the three men exploited wasn't ignorance. It was community. It was the trust that develops between people who share the same faith, the same cultural background, the same struggles of building a life in a new country. It was the bond that forms when you recognize someone's accent at church and realize they understand what it's like to be far from home. SEC would later call this an Affinity Fraud scheme. The defendants exploited common ancestry and religious affiliations to earn investors' trust. And for a while, the scheme actually seemed to work. Early investors received their monthly returns on time. Word spread through the community that first million was legitimate. More people invested. The company opened satellite offices in Florida and other states. Jali's confidence grew, along with the bank accounts. In a 2019 interview, he bragged about his success. "I own 28 cars that I bought, all cash, and I'm not talking cheap cars. I've never owned a Toyota in my life." However, Jali had a problem. Behind all the luxury cars and expensive suits, there was no actual trading happening. The returns being paid to early investors were coming directly from new investors' money, the textbook definition of a Ponzi scheme. And by spring 2019, the cracks were starting to show. First Million's bank accounts were frequently overdrawn by hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of the checks they sent to pay investors' monthly returns bounced. The bank froze several accounts, but instead of coming clean, Johnson and Frimpong did what desperate con artists always do. They kept soliciting new investments. They failed to tell anyone about the company's financial problems. They needed fresh money to keep the whole thing from collapsing. It didn't work. In May 2019, Jali and Frimpong called an investor meeting. They announced that First Million was dissolving. No explanation, no apology, just, "We're done." What happened next reveals exactly what kind of man Dennis Jali was. While his victims were still processing the news that their life savings were gone, Jali booked a flight to South Africa. He fled the country before authorities could arrest him. Around the same time, investigators discovered that Jali had tried to hire a digital forensics service. Not to help the investigation, of course. He wanted someone to bury news reports about a previous Ponzi scheme he had allegedly run in South Africa. He wanted those articles moved to the last page of Google search results or scrubbed from the internet entirely. It turns out Ali Johnson had known about Jali's past. According to the SEC lawsuit, Johnson was aware that Jali had been involved in an alleged fraudulent scam in South Africa before they ever started working together. But Jali denied the allegations, and Johnson accepted his denial and kept recruiting investors anyway. He chose money over due diligence. He chose his cut of the scheme over protecting innocent people from a known fraudster. The FBI began tracking down victims across the country. More than 1,200 people in Maryland, Texas, Florida, New York, and Georgia had invested money with First Million. The total amount lost exceeded $28 million. And where did all that money go? The indictment paints a clear picture. Jali allegedly spent $78,000 of investor money on private jet trips. He bought an Audi for $27,000. He picked up a Porsche for $20,000. Cash and cryptocurrency were transferred to the defendants and their family members. Lavish events at fancy hotels were funded with stolen money to recruit even more victims. Meanwhile, the victims were left with nothing. Nurses who had worked overnight shifts for years lost everything. Engineers and accountants who had carefully saved for retirement watched it all disappear. In August 2019, Jali was arrested in South Africa. He faced local fraud charges as well as possible extradition to the United States. Back in Maryland, federal authorities moved quickly. On July 27, 2020, a grand jury returned a 13-count indictment against all three men. The charges included conspiracy, wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. Frimpong was arrested at his Upper Marlboro home. Johnson surrendered to authorities. The SEC, the CFTC, and the FBI all filed cases against the defendants. And then came the trials. Johnson maintained his innocence. He went to trial in September 2022, and after 10 days of testimony and evidence, a federal jury convicted him on charges, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud and securities fraud. In January 2023, U.S. District Judge Theodore Chuang sentenced Ali Ray Johnson to 78 months in federal prison. That's 6.5 years behind bars, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Frimpong took a different approach. He pleaded guilty to wire fraud conspiracy and securities fraud, but the judge was not lenient. In March 2023, Frimpong received an even harsher sentence. 114 months in federal prison. That's 9.5 years. The court also ordered him to pay restitution, along with his co-defendants, totaling over $16.6 million for the victims' losses. But it gets worse. While the main scheme was collapsing, Frimpong had started his own separate fraud. He contracted directly with individual investors, making the same false promises about forex trading and guaranteed returns. Through this side hustle, he stole an additional $1.5 million from victims. As for Dennis Jali, the alleged mastermind, he remains in South Africa fighting extradition. U.S. authorities list him as detained pending extradition proceedings. In February 2023, he was expected to appear in a Gauteng court on related charges. The man who once bragged about owning 28 luxury cars now faces the prospect of spending decades in an American prison. The victims, meanwhile, are still waiting for justice. The court ordered restitution, but recovering $28 million from people who spent it on private jets and luxury cars is not exactly straightforward. Many victims have already accepted that they will never see their money again. The story of these 3 fake pastors is tragic, but it's also important because it shows exactly how affinity fraud works and why it's so effective. The scammers didn't target random strangers on the internet. They embedded themselves in communities. They exploited shared faith and shared heritage. They built trust over months and years before asking for money. They dressed in suits, rented nice offices, and created contracts that looked professional. They did everything possible to appear legitimate, and they specifically targeted immigrants. People who may not have had extensive experience with American financial regulations, people who relied on their community networks for advice and support, people who trusted their pastors to guide them toward a better life, not steal everything they had worked for. The FBI has since published warnings about affinity fraud, encouraging investors to be skeptical whenever they're offered investments promising low risk and guaranteed returns, even from members of a trusted community. They urge everyone to verify credentials and check SEC registration before handing over a single dollar. As for what the victims can do now, the SEC continues to pursue civil action against the defendants, seeking full restitution. But for many of those 1,200 people who lost their hard-earned savings, the damage cannot be undone. The money is gone. The trust has been shattered. They put their faith in men who claimed to serve God, and those men served only themselves. My name is Michael. Stay safe out there. Watch out for anyone promising guaranteed returns. And as always, thank you for watching.